April 14th found Washington City still abuzz with excitement. A beautiful Good Friday morning with clear skies. Willow trees along the Potomac River had awakened from their winter slumber and were now showing off their green new growth as their long branches blew back and forth on the soft spring winds. Fragrant white and soft pink flowers on the blooming dogwood trees called on bees and butterflies to feast upon their nectar, and the city's parks and gardens, now painted in the rainbow of colors as flowers bloomed, awaited being admired by an audience lazily strolling down the winding paths. It's 7 in the morning, and Mr. Lincoln has opened his eyes on this last dawn that he would lie them on. Join us in this part 2 as we explore the final hours in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Taking a seat opposite of his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, at the breakfast table, young Tad sat to his left. The president was in a joyful mood. Joining them was Robert Lincoln. Robert, a captain in the Union Army on General Grant's staff, had arrived the day before and was in the room at the McLean House in Appomattox when General Lee surrendered. After discussing the events of Appomattox, Abraham gave his son some fatherly advice, albeit unsolicited and unwanted, about the importance of finishing up law school. Mrs. Lincoln, breaking the tensions, said that she had tickets to Grover's Theater for the opening night of Aladdin, but she would prefer to see Our American Cousin, which was being performed at the Ford's Theater. She expressed her wishes that General Grant and his wife would join them. After breakfast, the president excused himself and went to work in his office. He sent a messenger to Ford's Theater to inform them of his planned attendance and to reserve the state box for the evening's performance. Throughout the late morning and early afternoon, Lincoln held a cabinet meeting. Deliberations regarding Reconstruction were held. Lincoln announced that he was open to suggestions, and various ideas were proposed on how to begin that process of reconciliation between the North and South. Also discussed was what to do with the leaders of the Confederacy. Lincoln spoke from the heart and was aligned with the second inaugural address when he said, "I hope there will be no persecution, no bloody work after the war is over. No one need expect me to take part in hanging or killing those men, even the worst of them. Frighten them out of the country, open the gates, let down the bars, scare them off. Enough lives have been sacrificed. We must extinguish our resentment if we expect harmony and union." Over at Ford's Theater, owner John T. Ford was away from Washington City visiting family in Richmond, the ex-Confederate capital. He left his brother Harry in charge of the theater's operation. Harry and the others were elated when they heard the news of their special guest for Good Friday's Our American Cousin performance. As Harry directed the staff to prepare the house right box and American flag bunting, John Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater to collect his mail. Booth used the theater's address for his mail delivery since he often performed there. Having read in the papers that the Lincolns would be attending the premiere of Aladdin at Grover's Theater the day before, Booth had reserved the box seats next to where the president would sit. Now, this change of venues was good news for Booth. He was intimately familiar with the performers and staff, as well as the theater layout and, what would be most important, the script and timing to the play, Our American Cousin. In Act 3, Scene 2, Booth knew the play's largest laugh-producing line would offer the distraction he would need to carry out his plan to murder the president. Booth left and began preparations to assassinate the president. He rented a horse from a stable on C Street, then visited the Kirkwood house where Vice President Johnson was staying and left a note. On a handwritten card signed J. Wilkes Booth was this short message: "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?" He then met with fellow conspirators and informed them that they would launch an attack to decapitate the U.S. government and began planning. That afternoon, he met with Mary Surratt at her boarding house several times and gave her a package containing a pair of binoculars. She took them to her tavern in Maryland to leave with her tenant, John M. Lloyd, instructing him to be ready for someone to pick up the package later, along with 2 carbine rifles and some whiskey. Around 4 o'clock, Lincoln had finished his day's work. Mary wished to go for a carriage ride, and Abe obliged her. By 5 o'clock, Abraham and Mary exited the White House and climbed onto their carriage for a short ride down to the Navy Yard. As they started down the gravel road of the White House, followed by 2 cavalry troops, Abraham took his wife's hand and promised her that things would get better for their relationship. The past 4 years had seen much sadness. Abe, always occupied and stressed with the ongoing war, as well as the tragic loss of their beloved 11-year-old son Willie in 1862, took a toll on the couple. The carriage arrived at the Navy Yard, and the president took a short stroll on the deck of the Monitor Montauk, then got back into the carriage for the short trip back to the White House. Mary told Abraham that a young couple, Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone, had accepted her invitation for that night's play. The Lincolns would pick up the couple at Harris's house on their way to the theater. At around 7 o'clock, Booth met with his conspirators, Azarat, Powell, and Harold, at a boarding house to coordinate their attacks. Booth would assassinate President Lincoln and, if possible, General Grant. He then chose George Azarat to kill Vice President Johnson, and Lewis Powell, aided by David Harold, to kill Secretary of State Seward. President and Mrs. Lincoln's carriage arrived at Ford's Theater at approximately 8:30, though the play had started around 8. The Lincolns' late arrival caused a brief pause in the first act, during which the audience greeted the president with a standing ovation as the band played Hail to the Chief. The president took his seat in a red-padded rocking chair next to his wife on the left side of the presidential box. Major Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, sat on the right side of the box. John Wilkes Booth arrived in the alley behind Ford's Theater at around 9:30 and asked Ned Spangler to hold his horse. Spangler, who had duties backstage, handed the horse off to Joseph Burroughs. John Wilkes Booth went inside and, after ascertaining that Lincoln had arrived, decided to go next door for a drink at the Star Saloon to calm his nerves. There, he ordered a whiskey and a glass of water. As he was leaving, someone in the saloon shouted to Booth that he would never be as good of an actor as his brother. Booth must have thought to himself that after this night, his brother would never be as famous as he. Lincoln's main bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, did not attend the play, and instead, John Parker, a police guard who had a love of whiskey, was assigned to protect the president instead. Parker left his post outside of the presidential box during intermission and headed to the Star Saloon next door with Lincoln's valet, Charles Forbes, and coachman Francis Burke. Parker and Burke remained at the Star Saloon, but Forbes did return. Between 10:15 and 10:20, Booth returned to Ford's Theater and made his way up the stairs towards the presidential box. He was armed with a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer pistol as well as a 7-inch hunting knife. As John Wilkes Booth neared the door that would lead him to President Lincoln's box, he was stopped by Charles Forbes. Booth presented him with his calling card, and after a short conversation, Forbes allowed him to enter the presidential box at approximately 10:30 during Act 3, Scene 2 of the play. Booth then quietly used a wooden brace which he had placed in the box earlier that day to barricade the outer door. In the short, darkened hall, Booth readied himself, the only light coming from a peephole in the door. As he peered through the hole, he could see that only a few feet on the other side sat the president. The actor was about to become the assassin. He listened for his cue. On stage, actor Helen Muzzy delivered her setup line. "I am aware, Mr. Trenchard, that you are not used to the manners of good society, and that, alone, will excuse you from the impertinence of which you have been guilty." The door to the presidential box opened softly. The president, Mrs. Lincoln, and their guests were absorbed in the play and didn't notice. Booth entered, and as he stepped towards the president, drew his Philadelphia Derringer pistol, aiming it point blank at the back of the president's head behind his left ear. On stage, Harry Hawk, facing upstage and bent over in a mocking bow, turned his face to the audience and delivered his reply. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dolladizing old man-trap." As expected, the crowd roared in laughter, and Booth the actor became Booth the killer as he pulled that trigger. Smoke from the tiny gun filled the box. The president slumped forward in his chair as the projectile pushed through his hair, scalp, skull, and brain before coming to rest behind his right eye. The crowd peeled their attention from the stage due to the out-of-place thunderous bang from Booth's pistol. Mary Todd Lincoln in that same moment first turned to see her beloved husband's chin coming to rest upon his chest, head slightly tilted, eyes closed as though he peacefully nodded off. Then she, in that instant, realized the terrible gravity of the situation as her eyes saw the smoke, the gun in hand, the arm that it was connected to stretched out and down, and those cold eyes that overwatched the horrendous deed. Her scream, painful, terrified, and haunting, filled Ford's Theater. Major Rathbone leapt to his feet and tried to subdue the assassin. Booth dropped his one-shot Derringer pistol to the ground, then using his hunting knife, slashed Rathbone on his left arm, cutting it down to the bone. Booth tried to escape by jumping from the box to the stage, but one of the spurs on his boots became tangled in the Treasury Guard flag hanging from his staff in front of the box. In a 12-foot drop, Booth landed awkwardly and broke his left leg. While up on stage, Booth held his bloody knife above his head and reportedly said, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always" to tyrants, followed possibly by "the South is avenged." As Booth staggered off the stage and fled out the back of the theater, Rathbone shouted for someone to stop him. Army Major Joseph Stewart leapt onto the stage in response and chased after Booth, almost catching him when he was able to briefly grasp the reins of Booth's horse. Booth was able to knock him away and escape down the alley behind the theater. Inside Ford's, it was pandemonium. Cries and screams coming from the president's box become overwhelming. Theatergoers either were jockeying for position to get a better look or trying to get out to spread the terrible news, and others sat sobbing in disbelief. Someone in the presidential box called out for a doctor. Army Surgeon Charles Leal, who was seated in the dress circle nearby, rushed to the door of the president's box, which was still jammed shut by Booth's obstruction. With help from some other audience members, Leal was able to break through the door to reach Lincoln. The president was taken from his chair and laid upon the floor so the doctor could examine him. Leal first assumed that Lincoln had been stabbed because Booth had held a bloody knife above his head, but soon he realized that the president was suffering from a bullet wound. Dr. Leal also recognized that this wound was mortal. He probed the hole which the projectile had made in the president's skull, dislodging a clot which relieved some pressure that was building on the president's brain. Lincoln's labored breathing stabilized. Army Doctor Charles Staff, who had been lifted up to the presidential box from the stage by audience members, agreed with Dr. Leal's grim diagnosis, as did a civilian doctor who had made his way to the dying president's side. Together, these men decided that it would be unseemly for the president to die in a theater, especially on Good Friday. Dr. Leal believed that Lincoln would not survive the carriage trip to the White House as well, so the doctors decided that he should be moved to the nearest house available. A group of men carried the president out of the front door of the theater while Dr. Leal gently cradled the president's head. A large crowd of onlookers had gathered. Most of whom minutes before were celebrating victory over Lee's Army of North Virginia were now bearing witness to the final moments of their leader's life. Some U.S. Army soldiers cleared a path for their mortally wounded commander-in-chief through the sea of shocked onlookers. Across the street, a man was beckoning to them. Gently, they took Lincoln into the Peterson house, where the man, Harry Safford, was boarding. Carrying him with tender care, they made their way through the dimly lit house and laid the president on a bed in a room at the end of the hall. Meanwhile, fellow Booth conspirator George Azerodt was drunkenly staggering down the streets of Washington City, which were now bursting with the news of the assassination. Azerodt was given the task of killing Vice President Andrew Johnson, had instead taken to the bar of the Kirkwood House. The Vice President was staying at the Kirkwood, and Azerodt had rented the room on the floor just above Johnson's. Azerodt, who had been a willing participant in the plot to kidnap Lincoln, was reluctant to commit murder. In the end, no matter how much liquid courage he could guzzle down, he could not bring himself to kill the vice president. However, another conspirator was calmly riding atop his horse, trying to figure out how to escape Washington City. After leaving a trail of bloody victims, Lewis Powell believed that he had accomplished his mission to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. Seward was in a carriage accident 9 days prior and was bedridden at his home on Madison Place, not too far from the White House. In severe pain from a shattered jaw and immobile due to a bulky metal splint that covered his upper chest and ran along the sides of his neck to the sides of his head, Seward was under the care of his daughter Franny, sons Frederick and Augustus, as well as an Army nurse named George Robinson. Powell, an ex-Confederate soldier, was from the South and did not know his way around Washington City. David Harold, who was from the area, was tasked by Booth to guide Powell. The pair arrived at Seward's house sometime after 10 o'clock. Harold was to watch the horses while Powell went inside on his deadly mission, carrying out the attack at approximately the same time as Booth's murder of the president. Then the two men would escape to the south. Powell walked up to the Seward home and knocked on the door. Seward's butler, William Bell, answered, and Powell informed him that he was there to deliver medicine. He told Bell that the medicine was from Seward's physician and that he had instructions to personally show Seward how to take it. Bell allowed him in. On the way up the stairs, Powell was met by Seward's son Frederick, who asked him to hand over the medicine. Fanny emerged from Seward's room and said, "Fred, Father's awake now." Powell turned as though he was going to head downstairs, but suddenly turned with his revolver drawn. He aimed the gun at Frederick's forehead and pulled the trigger, but it misfired, so he began to beat Frederick with it. Fanny slammed the door shut and started screaming. Bell, who was looking on in horror, ran outside screaming, "Murder, murder." This commotion frightened Harold, who abandoned Powell's horse and slipped away. Fanny opened the door again. Powell, now charging up the stairs, shoved past her to Seward's bed. He then tried to stab Seward with 4 or 5 blows, missing each time before finally lacerating him on his neck and face area. Seward's life saved by the metallic bracelet he was wearing on his neck to help heal his broken jaw. Hearing the commotion, another of Seward's sons, Augustus, ran into Fanny's room and sprung into action to fight off his father's attacker. Joining in the fray was Sergeant George Robinson. As Powell fought to leave, he stabbed Robinson twice in the shoulder and Augustus 7 times. After some struggle, Powell was able to break free from the 2 men, now running down the stairs with shouting, "I'm mad! I'm mad!" As he left the house, Powell ran into the State Department messenger, Emmerich Hansel, who he stabbed in the back. Powell found his abandoned horse, mounted it, and rode off calmly. Despite Powell's fierce attack, all those who were injured in the Seward home recovered from their injuries. Back at the Peterson house, several more doctors arrived to tend to the president, including Lincoln's personal physician, Robert K. Stone. Secretary of War Edward Stanton walked into the dying president's room and paused in disbelief. After regaining his composure, Stanton ordered the sobbing Mary Lincoln be removed from the room to better allow for the doctors to evaluate the president. Throughout the night, the doctors continued to tend to Lincoln. At the same time, U.S. government and military officials came and went from the house, visiting the dying president and comforting his grieving wife and son, Robert Todd Lincoln. Stanton began to coordinate the manhunt that would capture Booth and his co-conspirators, as well as ordering the strengthening of the defenses of the capital city. After almost 9 hours of unconsciousness, President Lincoln drew his last breath at 7:22 in the morning on April the 15th. Upon his death, Stanton famously said, "There lies the most perfect ruler of men the world has ever seen. Now, he belongs to the ages." To learn more about the life and death of President Abraham Lincoln, head into your school or local public library, or check out the description box below for links to the National Parks Ford Theater site, as well as the Ford's Theater website. Please share this video and subscribe if you haven't already, and on behalf of the History and Heritage Explorers, thank you. Until next time, keep on exploring.